Welcome to the Father on Purpose podcast, featuring author and ministry leader Kent Evans and business executive and military veteran Lawson Brown. This is a show for you, Dad. You want to be a godly and intentional father. Unfortunately, you've turned to these two knuckleheads for help. Let us know how that works out for you. Before we begin, remember this: you are not a father on accident. So go be a father on purpose. Please welcome your hosts, Kent and Lawson.
Hey, Dad, we are on part 2 of a 2-part series. So for those of you who are mathematically challenged, it's really easy to keep track of. There's a part 1 and there's a part 2. And today is part 2 of a quick series Lawson and I wanted to do on the epidemic of isolation. So if you, Dad, are feeling like you are completely isolated, you don't have friends, you don't have mentors, you don't have running buddies, you don't have guys you're discipling, this series is for you. And if you don't feel that way, then you probably are the exception to the rule. Many people feel that way. And so we're trying to help and do our little part in this corner of the world. So glad you tuned in. And if you dial back into last week's, we talked about the Surgeon General's warning about isolation. We talked about some of the biblical warnings against being isolated and the kind of foolishness that can come with that. And so this week we're going to talk about practical ways you can solve that problem. Before we dive in, Lawson, I have a secret dream that one day there will be a movie about my life. However, it's it's extremely unlikely that that's actually going to happen.
It's not looking good right now.
Not looking good. However, there is a movie coming out. If you're listening to this podcast when we release it around February of 2024, there's a movie coming out that's not about my life, but it is about an event that happened in my city and in the life of my church. So it's a really, really cool story about a true event that happened. Man, now it's been probably 30 years ago. The movie is called Ordinary Angels. The movie is called Ordinary Angels. And if you're listening to it right now, listening to today's podcast right now, you still have time to get your tickets and go see it at the theaters. We'll put the details in today's show notes. So if you're driving or cutting the grass, when you get inside, click the links and go snag some tickets and go see the movie Ordinary Angels. It's really powerful. You can take the whole family, especially you're like teenage kids and up. You can take them. It's an encouraging story about perseverance. And one of the key people in the story is this dad who feels hopeless and completely stuck and doesn't know what to do. But this dad comes around and ends up really serving his family in some powerful ways. So if you're looking for an encouraging story about fatherhood and perseverance, go see Ordinary Angels. And if you're hearing this, later this year in 24, or you're listening in 2027 and Jesus hasn't come back, I'm sure it's on some streaming service right now. Go check it out. Lawson, how are you doing, man? Are you excited about talking about isolation part 2?
Yeah. Anytime somebody says that, I remember back to a guy in a men's group that I was with, Todd, who used to say in prayer, closing prayer, especially on a day when he had something coming up later that afternoon that he was dreading at work or something like that, he would always say, and Jesus, if you are coming back anytime soon, could it be today before 1:00 Eastern?
Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah,
I know the feeling.
Sure.
Man, that's cool. I will say though, Kent, that was kind of a stretch, dude, to start with. I want a movie about myself. And then you're like, it was in my city. It's in my church. I mean, that was a weak tie.
It's basically a movie about me.
Right.
But just I'm not in it. I'm not in it exactly. But the main character, the lady in the movie,
okay, you're
going to think I'm kidding and making this part up. But for a period of her life, she actually was married to my uncle. True story, like absolutely true story. Crazy. But the wild thing is at the end of the movie, you know how they'll do like a true story movie, but nothing in the movie is actually from the true story. They're all actors. But at the end of the movie, they'll show clips from, the real guys, real people. And my pastor and all these guys, I saw them at the end, and I saw, the old Southeast Christian building. And so really, really cool, because I do remember that happening. Like I'm old enough to remember the event. I'm old enough to remember, them asking everybody to come out and help and it being this emergency situation. It's a very, very
Awesome.
cool story.
I can't wait to see it. That's great.
Last week, Lawson, we talked about being
Yep.
isolated. And what
Yep.
kind of lingering thoughts and ideas did you have around last week's podcast that you wanted to kick us off with this week?
All right. So this has been something on my mind for months, the topic of isolation, because it seems like more often than I would have thought possible had I, set out to do it. And I did not set out to do this, but in conversations with guys, it seems like more and more people, and maybe it had something to do, I don't know, I hate to always, point back at COVID, but it may have had something to do with, there was a time in all of our lives to some degree or another where we had to isolate. We had to, pull back into our homes, that sort of thing. Some areas of the country did it much more stringently than others, and some even countries did a whole lot more stringently than others. I met a guy who moved to where I live about a year ago, but he was from New Zealand, and so his mother and father, and I think one of his brothers, most of his family is still in New Zealand. And I forget how we got on the topic of the lockdowns and COVID, but the way that he described the lockdown there was drastically worse than anything I experienced. I mean, they were coming to people's homes, and if they found that they had been trying to go to like their, visit a relative or something like that, they would arrest them. And like it was serious in that world, or not in that world, but in that country. And he was remarking that it's so friendly here, and he's really enjoyed getting to know people. I met him at the fitness center, and so we traded phone numbers. We are hitting each other up every now and then, maybe once a week at the most. But the point he was making was, compared to what his mother and father are still feeling from being isolated versus himself and his family, it's night and day. And so I have been reflecting on isolation for some reason that was on my heart. And since then, for the last few months, I've been coming upon people who have felt that in their lives before, or know a relative. And so I say all that because I think it is unhealthy. I think it's detrimental. I think it is something where, if you are about having a godly relationship within your family, with your wife and your kids and other people, but you aren't branching out, I think that is exactly where the forces against us want. I think that's exactly the strategy, is keep everybody segregated and alone. In fact, I didn't have an opportunity all that much, but when I was in the Marine Corps, my regiment was in Somalia. My battalion was in all over the place, and for one period of time, 2 months or so, we were in downtown Mogadishu, and we had taken the soccer stadium as our home. And because it had a wall around it, we put up wire. We could, stay inside in safety.
Wow.
And at one time, Mogadishu was where they hosted the Olympic trials for Africa, and it was a resort community. It's on a beautiful stretch of the ocean. And this stadium was where that was held. So at one time, it was a beautiful, setup. Anyway, we would take people that were basically out running guns or drugs, and we'd capture them, bring them in, and process them. And part of the processing was separating them and putting them alone. And the reason you do that is because you don't want them, you want to break up their camaraderie, if there is any. You want to make them lonely and afraid. It's much easier to feel loneliness and fear when you're by yourself versus in your group or in a group. And then we would compare stories that they're telling us. We would compare facts that they claim
Wow.
And then use that. Even if we had to lie, we would go to one and say, this is what the other one said, and get them all twisted up. And I think that can happen to us in isolation and aloneness. And so I think it's really important that we as dads understand you're putting yourself at risk, you're putting your family at risk, you're putting your relationships at risk. And I would submit you're putting your faith and your relationship with God at risk when you are ongoing remaining in isolation.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a very, very important topic.
Man, I have a friend in my life. His name is John. And he texted me not long ago. And he basically just said, how's your wife doing? And he jokingly said, how's your husband doing holding up? Her husband, how's your wife doing? How's her husband doing? And he's a good friend of mine. And probably not more than a week or two will go by without us talking and connecting. And he's one example of a really good friend I have in my life who I know is praying for me. I know is asking me questions about how I'm doing. I know I can take anything to him. And then there's a group I have every Wednesday at 4 Eastern. We get on, and there's usually there's a total of 5 of us, and then there's always about 3 of us that can make it. Some weeks we get lucky and everybody's there. But we just spend an hour together talking about. And yesterday, one of the guys on the call said, "Hey, what's the most important? Who on the call has something deep in their soul that they need to talk about?" And then one guy, Johnny, brought a subject up, and the 3 of us talked about it for an hour. It was really powerful, and it was about, how we can instantly be selfish, how we can demand things of other people, how we can get sideways in organizations, and end up building little cliques and factions of people who see it like we do, and then there's an us and a them. And so we had a 50-minute conversation about that, and we prayed together, and it was really rich, man. It was really fruitful. And so I have, over the last several years, I'm in my early to mid 50s as we record this one. I've had to be more intentional in this area, like putting a block of time on my calendar every week, or even keeping a list in my iPad of people I'm praying for. I was on a call last night, a Zoom call with a buddy of mine who, you mentioned someone being from New Zealand. He's actually a New Zealander. He lives now on the coast of Australia, but he's originally from New Zealand. And we connect every month or two for about an hour long Zoom call. And it's wild, Lawson. It's like we pick up where we left off, and it's like 2 minutes went by, and we laugh, we encourage each other. We ask, how can I pray for you? We ask, what's the big current challenge in your, either family or work life? And that's a 1-hour conversation that's super fruitful and really encouraging. And I want to encourage the dad that we're talking to today to think of this through 2 lenses. One lens is, man, you need this. You need friends. And that we've talked before about that, Paul, Barnabas, Timothy type relationships. You need somebody you got your hand up to, who's a mentor. You might need 5 or 10 of those kind of guys that mentor you in different areas, or you have access to based on what's going on in your life. And you need some Barnabases, some running buddies who are kind of maybe at your similar age and stage, or they have a similar set of experiences and they're running with you through life. And then you need some Timothys that you've got your hand reached down to in terms of their growth pattern. And they might be ahead of you in some areas, but behind you in others, or they're just younger, or they're newly married, or whatever. And for us to have those 3 people in our life, I want a dad on the call today to kind of take a little mental inventory of, if those are 3 buckets in your life, and they may not all be the same size bucket. Maybe a couple are bigger than others, but which of those buckets is totally empty? Is it that you can't name one running buddy that's kind of similar age and stage that you're going through life with? Maybe you just moved. Maybe you just relocated to a new city and you don't have those folks yet. Maybe you hop on a Zoom with the guys in your old town till you build the new geographically closer relationships. Cause I use Zoom to great effect, man. Our prayer group of 5 guys on every Wednesday, we've never all been in the same room. In fact,
No kidding.
Two of the five, I've never met face to face. And I've been on the call with these guys for 2 years, and I would tell them anything. Good dudes.
Yeah,
so they don't have to live down the street.
Right.
Or maybe it's the mentors. Maybe you don't ever reach out to guys for help, and you don't have anybody leaning into your marriage, or you don't have an older dude who's been. I talked to a guy recently, Lawson, who has had, like, if I have worked with 100 people, in my career, or he's worked with 10,000. Like, it's it's not even close. Right. He's had big, giant organizations that have reported up to him. And so I look at that and go, oh my goodness, that dude has forgotten more. I sent a job description to a guy today who used to run an HR staffing company. And I'm like, look, I've created 15 of these job descriptions in my entire career, and you've seen 15,000.
Mm-hmm.
Would you please tell me how I could make this better? Because, man, mentors are all around me. And then maybe it's the bucket of Timothy's that's completely empty. You got some running buddies, you might have a couple mentors, but you're not actively pouring into anybody. And that's the bucket. So maybe this is your year where you look at those 3 buckets and you fill those buckets up. But that's one side of a coin, I think, Lawson, is like Paul, Barnabas, Timothy. That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is, because you're probably listening to this as a dad, and you probably are a father who wants to be a father on purpose, or you wouldn't be at this particular podcast outpost. Where are your kids in that area? So as you look at your children, if your child's 6 years old, well, he doesn't have Paul, Barnabas, and Timothy relationships but if you have a 20-year-old child, or you have a 30-year-old child, they should probably have people in all those buckets. I was having a conversation with one of my boys not long ago, and he's in his mid-20s, and we were just talking about, who do you have in your life that gives you godly counsel? Because when he was 16 or 18, that was easier. He had teachers and professors, and he had me and other guys in our town, and they kind of came naturally, right? They were baked into his everyday life. But as you hit your 20s, you might have to be more intentional. You may have to go to your boss. And so some of us who are dads, we need to be coaching our kids with this kind of 3 bucket type mentality and asking these questions of our families. So we got to do it as dads, and we've also got to coach it with our kids.
Yep. You explained that Paul, Barnabas, Timothy really, really well. And I think that's a huge point. Let me ask you this. So I think it's really cool that you've had this, 2+ year men's group going on where you've basically done it all virtually. I remember back to, again, bringing up COVID, when my company first began to go down the road of, oh no, what do? We have physical locations all across the country. And in those locations, people have to come together and get things done. But, and so we had to do some, physical contact and stuff like that, within those branches. But there's a whole other layer of us that doesn't necessarily go to branches all that often.
Yeah.
And most of what we did was on a phone call. Or a flight to get there in person, and we all transitioned to virtual. And so we've learned a lot. And I think schools have come a long way and that sort of thing. I think relationships have come a long way with video calls. It's strange to say, but it's almost kind of like, it doesn't feel quite as good and normal to talk to somebody on just a regular cell phone call when there's an option to have them on video.
On
you
FaceTime,
get
or video, right.
Right. So I applaud you for that, and I do something similar. But question 1, and I'm going to turn it back to you, is what do you think versus that the value of in-person time can be? I've got my own take and a story. And then also, one-on-one is one thing. Another is a small group. Whether it's virtual or in person, regardless, it's individually, going through life together, whether it be a Timothy or a Paul, or as a small group get together. There's two aspects of this relationship building, of this doing life together, of being a dad, being a father on purpose in non-isolation.
Yeah.
And so what do you think the value and importance of those are? In person
Yeah.
And then secondly is small group.
Well, I can't imagine that there's ever going to be a virtual experience. And who knows, maybe we'll get to like olfactory or there'll be sensing. I don't know what's going to happen, but I can't imagine there's ever going to be a virtual experience that's going to be as valuable as face to face. Like you can, having said that, I think with video conferencing, you can get a relationship to like an A or A minus. You can pretty high. I don't know if it's ever going to be A plus until you can like break bread together, or you can walk down the golf course fairway together, or you can sit across the table. And I think a lot of that comes from just the theology of presence. There's like what a lot of people wanted in the Old Testament was just God's presence. They're like, God, would you not leave me? There's something about the presence of the Lord, which is why in our modern era, since Jesus, the presence of the Lord lives inside us in the form of the Holy Spirit. And that's just an obvious theological thread that if you pull at it, there's nothing that will ever, we're not going to get to heaven and God's going to meet with us on Zoom. Like that's not the way that's going to work. It even says there won't need to be a sun in heaven. And the reason there won't need to be a sun in heaven is because God himself will illuminate heaven. And so it's going to be different. There's going to be light everywhere because his presence is often described as light. And so there's going to be a presence. And so you can't really, I was with a guy recently at coffee, and even just like laughing together, when he was telling me something that was more private, he could be quiet and he could kind of look around and he go, here's the thing, you got to know this. And so there was just some of those cues that made me feel heard and listened to, and even just his facial expression and that I could see him and he was 2 feet away. There's no replacement for that in my view, but there are some people that I am heart aligned with that I'm just not geographically aligned with. And man, I love getting with those dudes on Zoom and video calls. The other thing you're asking about small group that I find really interesting is maybe the first, I didn't even mean for this to happen, but maybe the first one's about presence. The second one's about perspective. They both start with the letter P, and that is that.
Wait, say that again. I need to write that down.
Presence and perspective. And so you're such a doer. In the small group format, you end up with different perspectives than just yours or just that guy's. And so you'll hear a guy will say, I'm having problem A, and you'll be thinking, okay, there's solution B, and it'll start to come to your mind. And before it comes out of your mouth, someone else in the group goes, well, here's solution D. And then you go, oh,
right,
that's interesting. And then all of a sudden you come up with solution E, F, and G. And there's like a whole big basket of thoughts that happen because you have, the way Proverbs would put it, right, is in the wisdom of many counselors, there is victory. There's victory in the wisdom of many counselors. And so I do find that depth of perspective is harder to achieve just one-on-one, because then, person A says something, person B says something, and all of a sudden everybody's connecting dots and the synapses are firing. We've all probably been in good brainstorming sessions or good counseling moments with a group of 3 or 4 or 5 people where you're like, wow, I didn't think of that. And I'm glad he did or she did. And I find that to be really rich when I can get a small group together thinking about a common topic.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be 5 or 6 people. I've got, just throw it out as an example, I've had for over 25 years, Pete and Michael and I have had a commitment to each other that we're going to get together in person. Let's not let a few months go by before we don't try to get back together and do something. Hiking, having fun. We camped a lot. And there's an element of like dedicated time that's more than an hour long Zoom or a text message here or there, which we text almost every day. In fact, and we talk periodically on the phone, but there's something richer, more deep about being together in person. And I can't tell you how many things in my life, how many decisions in the life of my own life and my family, that have been concluded upon in those times when we've been together. And you're right. It's this 3-way, in our case, 3-way bouncing off of one another, that I think is just, it's so critical. And I'm imagining the dad who is hearing this. Let's say that we have made a compelling argument so far that isolation.
That's a stretch. That's a stretch. But okay, fine. I'll play the game. I'll play your little game.
If we're not successful after what have we been on this podcast? How long I've been talking to you now? It's a couple hours. It feels
too
like
long. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
Feels like a lifetime.
Right. So if we have some, buy-in, I hope that isolation is bad, being with each other for the right reasons and with the right people is good. There are still barriers in place or mental obstacles, which are probably generally around time. I'd love to do that. I'd love to go and, take a Friday, Saturday and go hang with a couple of buddies. I don't have the time for that because of fill in the blank, or I just happen to be in this time of life, this season of life where we've got 3 little kids and, I just don't have time to go out and, go to dinner with a friend of mine. I wish I could. And those are legit. I think those are truly legitimate. But I want to double down on the fact that it's so, you build a 20-year relationship by starting today. And so then down the road and between now and then, which is down the road 20 years, that's where life is done. And so to protect ourselves, to protect our family, to enrich our family, doing it in isolation ain't going to cut it. And so we have got to figure out, how do you get over that element of time?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that is super interesting, I because of technology, which has a lot of downsides, obviously, with screen time and wasting time and even doorways into illicit things you shouldn't be spending time on. One of the advantages of technology is you can get a lot done by text pretty quick. Or you could even have a quick phone call. I'm making more use of my drive time. Not all the time. I mean, sometimes windshield time is good just to think. And, as the maybe legend, maybe it's totally true, but, goes about Warren Buffett is he'll spend an hour a day just staring out the window, just having some thought. So I don't want you to go cramming every split second of free time.
Right.
But today I'm leaving a lunch meeting with our board chairman, and I had a text message from a guy who I hadn't met yet, and I had about a 15-minute drive home. So I just punched it and caught him, and we talked for 15 minutes. Great. I made good use of the windshield time. And so for me, we can capture little moments of time where your whole day might be packed, but you are going to drive from that lunch meeting back to the office. And those 20 minutes, you could either spend them listening to a sports call-in show, or you could spend them listening to music, or you could spend them praying or calling your wife. There's lots of great options. One of the things you might end up doing is you may call your friend and say, hey man, just, I got a really busy afternoon and I got a tough meeting at 3:00, assuming Jesus doesn't come back by 3 Eastern, would you pray for that meeting? And then you hang up. Like I literally talked to that friend I mentioned, John. I talked to him this morning for 6 minutes. And the only thing he wanted to tell me was a hilarious story about his daughter. And we both laughed, and that was it. He told me a quick story. We laughed, we got off the phone. And those little touch points are easier and easier to do now with technology than at any time in, human history. So capturing brief 2 and 10-minute moments.
That's very practical.
It's never been more easy to do. A couple other things I would say as guys are thinking, okay, Kent Lawson, y'all have made a half-baked case for this, which is better than what you normally do. Normally don't even get that far. Therefore, I'm interested. I'll take the bait. What do I do? Well, I think, at least for me, and this might depend a little bit on personality or whether you work first shift or whatever. Like there's all kinds of nuances. But for me, the things that get on my calendar are the things that tend to get done. And the things that don't get on my calendar usually don't. And so if something's just floating around in my text or it's in a notepad somewhere, I might get lucky and God might point it back out. It may happen. But man, I put a few things related to friends on my calendar every week. I got prayer time on a Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern. I keep a short list of people that I'm praying for. When I read scripture in the mornings, this is good and bad. I won't say always, and maybe not be true, but man, it feels like always God brings people to mind while I'm reading. This morning it was Acts 24. And while I was reading Acts 24, I thought of a specific guy. And this is bad, you got to be careful, but I'll pick up my phone and text that guy and say, "Hey man, thinking about you. Hope you're doing well. Anything I can pray for."
You're saying dangerous. Like the key is to put it right back down.
Yeah. Because then I'll be, next thing I'll be on there for an hour reading news headlines. And so that's not necessarily advice per se, but I do find, even now, I got one of those old school Post-it note dispensers over Christmas, because I'm starting to put those ideas on a Post-it note and set them aside so I do not pick up my technology. But then when I'm done with my Bible study, and some mornings I may study for 15 minutes, some mornings I may study for an hour, just depending on how much time I have and what I'm in the middle of. At the end of that hour, I'll sometimes have a Post-it note next to my Bible with 3 things on it, or 2 people.
Yeah, there you go.
And then I'm like, awesome. Then I'm going to take 10 minutes, text those 2 people, throw the Post-it note in the garbage, and move on with my life. So I don't pick up technology as quickly. But man, I find when I'm in God's word, he gives me, ideas for content, things about people, podcast topics. They come flooding at me almost in a way where it's distracting from what I'm actually trying to do. And that's both the blessing and the curse of the creative mind is they're coming at me real fast, but I got to find a way to park them. But as they relate to friendship and lack of isolation, he brings people to mind for me all the time. And so in that way, your cell phone might be your best ally to stay in touch with people over time, and just text them real quick and say, "Hey, I'm praying for you." The other thing that I want to say, Lawson, by way of just practical ideas for a guy who's trying to build more intentional friendships in his life, try to find the overlaps in your interests.
That's right.
So one of the reasons this Wednesday afternoon prayer group, and we've had a guest on, Jeff Kemp, who wrote a book called Receive. He's a good friend of mine, and
I get a text every now and then from him out of the blue.
Yeah,
just an encouragement, an encouraging text. He's so great.
Yep, and one of the things that he did is this particular Wednesday huddle is a group of 5 of us who all speak and teach and write. So we started with the common interests of, we've all been up front. We've all had the pressure to be on the mic. We've all written the book that no one ever bought, so we've all had similar kinds of, we all got plenty of kindling. We like to call those books. And so if the guys are listening, sorry guys. But the truth of the matter is we started with a pretty heavy amount of shared interests. We're married. We got kids, there's a long list of things we already have interest. Every now and then, and you and I've been part of these, Lawson, I'm sure, where your company will start a mentoring initiative, and every VP gets 5 directors, and every director gets 5 managers randomly selected by HR. And then you sit down with these people and you're like, God, I hate this person, or like, I have nothing in common, or man, he rubs me the wrong way. And then, but nope, you're going to be their mentor for a year, or they're going to be
Kent, like, that is so harsh.
Oh, gee whiz. And so it's only because it's mechanical, right? There's no relational. Yeah, it's a little forced. And so what I find is, even for example, I love to laugh and have some fun, right? Sometimes that makes me the class clown, and certain kinds of people find me super irritating in that regard. Awesome. I don't want to be their friend either, so they can beat it. You know what I'm saying? But I do find some degree of shared kind of what we find interesting or funny, or shared temptations, even whatever. Look for some of those shared interests, and you might end up finding that it's one dad who's got a kid on the same sports team, but it's not every dad who has a kid on that same sports team. Just because their kids are on the same sports team, that may not be your small group, but there might be 2 guys there who are, or you may find in your Sunday school that you go to that's got 10 couples in it. There's 2 couples in there that you and your wife just really get along with. awesome. Look for those like synapses and those kind of tuning fork moments where you feel like you're on the same wavelength, and then invest in the direction where there's already some overlap. It may be maybe your job, maybe your sense of humor, maybe your life stage. But man, if you've got some overlap, it sure makes for a better friend.
Yeah. I've been praying for some friends here. We've lived here for a few years, and I love the guys that are in my life. But there is something about getting to see a familiar face, often where you live. And I wonder if this guy that I mentioned before from New Zealand, his name is Dan. I suspect God put him in my life. We've had enough conversations where I've picked up on a lot of common interests, and I appreciate God for that. I was open to it.
Yeah.
And I think in our lives sometimes that helps us. If you, Dad, are hearing this and reflecting back, and you're like, yeah, I've kind of maybe not tried to be alone. I've not tried to isolate myself, but I sure haven't been open to expanding. And in the case of Dan, so we've run across each other at the gym. Let's say 4 or 5 times. Well, last week I was flying out of the this little airport, and guess who was there? Getting on the same flight as me, Dan.
Oh, no
Then,
kidding.
yeah, and check this out. So it was a day when all those storms were coming through a week or so
Oh,
ago.
that one day. Yeah,
That one day. Remember that one
Mhm.
day?
Oh gosh, yeah, everybody does.
So anyway, we're on the plane, like it was bad to the point that they took the plane back to the gate and got us off and inside the airport away from windows because it was storming so bad. The airport lost power, lights go out. So I'm saying all that to say Dan and I were hanging out for a good 2 hours. Now we were doing work calls and stuff like that. We weren't just sitting there. But I got to know him better. And I'm hoping that is something, I hope God put him in my life as some degree of, I don't know if he's a Paul or Timothy or where in between, right? But I'm going to go with it. Is my point. And we have an overlap of interests.
Yeah.
I had been praying for someone. I feel like there's a degree of trust kind of being built, relational. And so what started as this kind of brief, like you were saying, like realize those brief moments and make something of them. Who knows, man? This may be turning into something, and I'm curious where God is leading us.
Yeah. Well, and you're open to it. Like, I think that's what's maybe sets you apart in some ways is, and maybe that's only mission you and I were on these last 2 episodes is to just have a dad be open to it. Because I find once you're open to it, it's like that, your reticular activating system in your brain. Once you get in a red car, all you see are red cars, right? Once you become a golfer, everything's a golf course. And so you start to see what you think you should see. Well,
I remember you brought this up a long time ago on a podcast, the reticular something or another.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you remembered the first out of the word. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for recalling that so accurately. But it's true, right? It's the way our brains help us process life is you don't notice everything. I'm sure there's 100 things in this room I'm in my basement that I've no longer noticed because I've seen them so often. And I just think if you're looking for a connection, if you're looking for friends, if you're looking to not be isolated, God's going to bring those Dans into your life where you're like, man, we're on the same flight together, et cetera. And if we're open to it, it's funny how your brain starts to fill in those gaps and find it when you are willing to start looking for it. And I want to remind the dad listening, we do this, I think, pretty regularly on the show. And that is not only are we doing this because we need it, and that should probably be enough. Like, I don't just try to go do spiritual disciplines so my kids catch me doing spiritual disciplines, but sure doesn't hurt, right? But so I'm going to do them anyway. I'm going to be in the Word, even though my son in Nashville ain't going to see me studying God's Word every morning.
Right. Yeah.
Having said that, I am trying to set that pattern. And if you're isolated and you're alone and you have no running buddies and no one you're mentoring, man, guess what?
Right.
Your kids you're going to come off as a hypocrite, and you have low credibility in this area. So if you want your kids to live unisolated, connected lives in community,
there you go.
then probably, maybe we should get on the set the good example train.
Yep. Right on. Right on. Man, this has been good. I'm glad we tackled it. I wondered where it was going to lead. I don't know that we're done with it, but for this little 2-part series on it, I think this has helped reinforce some things for me. And Dad, I hope this has called you to action, and or maybe you're doing it great and you need to help share that vision with somebody in your life who isn't. Because I know this, we as dads are a collective movement that God is working in, and he needs us to hear his calling to come together. And there are number of resources out there that can help with it. Go to Manhood Journey. There's a ton of resources there, and be open to it. It takes a little bit of effort, and before you know it, that little bit of effort that you put in, God compounds and brings it all together. Thanks a lot. See you next time.
Hey, Dad, thank you for listening to today's show. If you found this episode helpful, remember, you can get all the content and show notes at manhoodjourney.org/podcast. And if you really liked it, please consider doing 3 things. Number 1, share this podcast with someone. You can hit the share button in your app, wherever you listen to podcasts, or just call a person up and tell them to listen in. Number 2, subscribe to this podcast so you get episodes automatically. That helps us as well to help dads find the show. You can do that through your favorite listening app, whatever that is. And finally, review this podcast. Leave us a review, good or bad, wherever you listen. Those reviews also help other dads find the show. You can always learn more about what we're up to at manhoodjourney.org or fatheronpurpose.org. We will see you next week.